crises and plan for them as we go. Please do feel free to write questions in the chat as we go, and there'll be time for questions and answers at the end. So the session for today just follows this format, which is understanding the risks, preparing for them, probably the key biggest point here that I'll talk about, responding to any risks or crises that happen, and then, as I said, we'll have time for questions and answers at the end. So, understanding the risks. Well, what is a risk in the first place? So a risk is actually a measure of a threat. So, for example, terrorism might be a threat, corrupt soldiers, disease, criminal gangs. They're all threats, and a risk is measuring how likely that threat is to happen. And then also using that is also your vulnerability. So that could be the vulnerability of a person or an organization. And that might mean vulnerability could be that your organization has no procedures, people are not trained, there's no internal responsibility. So it's assessing those vulnerabilities and those threats which make you decide on the risk and how big it is. And it's really important for organizations to understand exactly what threats they're facing, as well as where your exposure is. It's important to remember that threats can be both inside and outside the organization. So inside the organization, it could be staff or associates that could be causing a threat, let's say with safeguarding violations, committing fraud. And externally, well, there's a whole host of threats. COVID, obviously, being the primary one that springs to everybody's mind when they think about external threats at the moment. Hopefully, that will become less as we go on. It is really important to understand what the threats are and also what those vulnerabilities are. And as these can create different threats. So having no systems in place to account for your money might encourage someone to steal it. If you've got a brand new vehicle that sits outside your office, but it's not insured, that's going to be a problem and a risk. And also withdrawing large sums of money to pay for project costs might attract someone, a criminal, to thinking, right, they've got loads of money, let's go and hack their systems. So it could come from anywhere. So mapping your risks will really help you understand how serious they are and where your vulnerabilities are. And then I'm going to say this again and again throughout the session, but reviewing the risks, mapping them, understanding, and seeing how they change with the context that you are in can really benefit you from stopping these risks escalating and becoming a crisis. Okay, so is it a risk or is it a crisis? So it's really important to remember that a risk can be manageable if you monitor it. And it's really important to understand the context of the risk, as the risk you face can escalate into a crisis if you don't understand the context or know why it's happening. So an example of this would be, let's say you've got a conservation patrol, they've gone out into the park, but your team hasn't heard from them for several days. And you realize that you can't contact them, you don't know where they are, it's a large park, and there have been reports of militia groups operating in the area over the last few days. But you haven't been monitoring where they are. So now you've got a missing team in a high threat area and you know they're vulnerable. And what could have been a manageable risk if you'd understood all the risks and mitigated for them. So if you'd thought about the patchy communication, maybe the radios aren't working, if you followed where the militia groups were, you could have managed that situation, and what would have been small risk has suddenly escalated into a crisis, and the team could be kidnapped or lost or worse. Okay, so that's an example of where a risk escalates into a crisis. So we want to keep those as small as possible. And you just have to know how to manage them. So I'm just going to ask you just to think for a bit. And if you can, click on the chat button and just type in, and this will take a little bit of thinking, so I'll give you a few moments. The biggest risks you think your organisation may face in the next 3 years. And anybody can answer this because everybody will have a different opinion about what those risks might be. So take a moment, have a think about your organisation, and perhaps put in the top 2 risks maybe that your organisation faces. I'd encourage FFI staff to do this too if you would like. Okay, and WCS, all organisations, have a think. Oh yeah. So Chloe started us off, staff burnout. Yes, staff getting overworked, overtired, taking too much on, and particularly in a charity setting that can happen quite often. Oh no, I'm sorry, you're struggling with your signal. Very limited funding. Yeah. Losing forest area. Okay, so yeah, we've got an actual threat to the environment. Martha, risk of high staff turnover. Yep. We don't know our new strategy. Nancy, uncertainty during transition. Yes. Kay, over-reliance on a small number of people. Big one. Chloe, loss of data due to poor storage. Yeah. Lack of funding, that's a big one. Diversified funding. Okay, that's interesting. Claire, development of the nearby island causing pollution in the marine environment. Yeah. Nancy, global recession. Okay. Julie, financial frauds. Thank you. So there's a lot. And if you notice, we've got both internal and external risks coming up here, and not only to our organisation, but to the environment in which we work that we need to account for. And some of these risks are seemingly very large. Global recession, that will affect everybody. And some of them are fairly specific to the region or to perhaps the organisation. So staff turnover and reliance on a small number of people. So this has just come very quickly from asking you as an audience the risks that are there. And already, you're probably already seeing some of these responses and more are popping into your head. So it's got the thinking going, and this is what I wanted to encourage. And this is the sort of thing that you can do with your teams in your organization. What are the threats that face us? And have a brainstorm. And that's the first step. Thank you for participating in that. It's also a little bit scary, but we will plan and manage those risks. So I just want to talk a little bit more also about health, safety and security. And this is a little more about what G focused on too. And a lot of the risks sit within this area. But what's the difference between health and safety and security? And I know in several languages, actually, these are very similar terms. So, but for us, health and safety is a risk, a hazard that poses harm to an individual or a group of people in the form of an accident. So there's a car crash, slipping on a surface, accidentally starting a fire, or even not being able to put one out. Security is a threat which poses harm to an individual or group or their assets through a malicious act. So a cyber threat. So your IT systems being threatened through Hackers is one security issue. And then we also have terrorism is there as a security issue. We mentioned militia groups earlier. So malicious acts is a security threat. And if we're not aware of them, what impact can they have? So if we don't think about how they can affect our organization, then there's lots of things that can happen. So the impacts of not having health and safety could actually be one of the biggest is just stopping your work. Your work is halted. You can't go out and do what you need to do. You can't follow your mission, and therefore everything just stops. Let's say something happened, people were missing on a field trip, all sorts of things can happen. People can take legal action depending on what happens to your staff and what happens to your employees. If you or your staff are found to be negligent, this could lead to criminal charges. So this shows. It could also damage your reputation if the media or press start finding out, and they discover one problem, they begin to think about what other problems, and it can really harm your organization's reputation. And even one simple thing can cause problems. And then again, if donors and partners find out, they might lose trust in what you're doing, and they may close down funding and or the partnership itself because they are not sure what you're like as an organization and decide to just take a step back. And also staff may lose their jobs as a result. So actually what could have been a small manageable risk, let's say donors start to remove their funding because of some sort of negligence or something that's happened, staff then lose their jobs, and this crisis that was small grows into a bigger crisis, and it's almost self-perpetuating. So we need to keep an eye on that. Now, this is a lot of text. Don't try and read it all, okay? And this is what we call a risk register. So thinking about all those risks, this is one way to record and brainstorm. And I know some of you who are here have seen this type of risk register before, and some of you may not or have a different way. But recording your risks is great and thinking about what they are, but it's no good unless you treat this risk register like a live document and make sure that all risks are being checked and reviewed. So we've got a risk here and we've put mitigations up in place, but if we're not following them, it can create a false risk rating. So we've said, yes, we are going to do this in order to manage a risk. But if you don't follow it, it's not worth the point of having it. The key points for this register, as well as identifying the risk, are actually having someone responsible to oversee it, and holding staff to account in terms of who is responsible for making sure this mitigation happens. I know in our team, we've actually had someone who has been operating, who's just found out they're in charge of a risk, and they weren't aware that they were in charge of a potential risk. So communication is also key in letting people know who's in charge of overseeing what risk. And timeframes are also important. So we need to have sorted this risk out by the end of, in the next 6 months. Make sure you stick to that time, because if you become complacent and you forget, the risk is more likely to escalate into a crisis. There are lots of different types of registers, and we actually have a whole webinar on deep diving into this type of risk management, and that's available on our Capacity for Conservation website. So you can see and hear more about this type of register to find out how it might be useful for you. And I'll put a link in the Slack chat at the end of the session. So the key takeaway from everything that I've just spoken about is that you identify your risks, but then you have to do something about them. but actually knowing what your risks are and the context in which they sit can help you identify what you do and how you might manage them. So it's all great to have this register, but it's like your homework list or your timetable when you're at school. Yes, I've got it all down, but actually you've got to go and do it. Okay. And thanks, Claire. I've just seen your question and I will have, if we've got time at the end, have a go at answering that. But yes, the scores are interesting. So we're now going to prepare for the risks. And I've got an example here to help explain how you might prepare. So this is just individually. This is, imagine, and you possibly, many of you already experienced this. I'm going to go through and use malaria as an example here about how you might prepare for a risk. So you're in a high-risk malarial country. Some of you might be already, some of you are visiting, where there is a high chance of catching malaria from a mosquito. If you don't do anything at all, the likelihood of you getting bitten by a mosquito and contracting malaria is high. So the likelihood is high that you'll get it if you don't take any preventative measures. And then the impact on you as a person is also high. So the chances are you'll get sick. And if you're vulnerable because you might have an underlying disease or because of your age, the consequences can be quite huge. However, if you take preventative measures, so mosquito nets over your bed, screens on windows and doors, you treat your clothing with either the horrible chemical DEET or you have natural stuff, the likelihood of you contracting malaria or even getting bitten by a mosquito is much lower. So we reduce the likelihood of you getting bitten. We could also decrease the impact if by taking anti-malarial drugs. If you happen to be able to afford anti-malarials, that's one way to decrease the impact. But also if you contract malaria, going to hospital quickly, understanding what the symptoms are for malaria can also help you lessen the impact. And remember, the symptoms can happen a long time after you've been bitten. So it's good to be aware of what they are. But if you don't do that, obviously it goes back up. So you can become complacent. Oh, it's fine. You know, I'm not going to get bitten, or I've done enough just by pulling my sleeves down. Well, actually, then the likelihood of you getting bitten and contracting malaria goes back up. Okay, so that was from an individual perspective, but you also can take this example to an organizational level. So let's think about safeguarding. And safeguarding means to protect a person or your organization from harm or damage with an appropriate measure. So incidents can happen at work which need to be safeguarded against. And they might be things like bullying, racism, sexual abuse, discrimination, and that's incidents that you need to be safeguarded against. And if you don't have safeguarding procedures in place, they can have severe implications not only for the individual, but also they can damage the organization's reputation and also donor rejection. So no safeguarding procedures in place, high impact and high likelihood of something not good happening. You can reduce the likelihood of these happening, these incidents, by having a safeguarding policy, follow rules. You can have a procedures and complaints process. You can have training for staff about how to recognize incidents and what to do to manage them. And that will reduce the likelihood of these happening. Oops, that's the one. But then you can also reduce the impact of these by having a complaints process, an investigation process, clear reporting and disclosure and any incidents that happen throughout the organization. And then Predators or people who want to do harm to the organisation, both within and externally, can be put off if you have these robust procedures in place. So low impact, low likelihood if you have things in place to mitigate against any problems. If you get complacent and if you forget or the rules aren't followed, obviously that all goes out the window and everything increases. Okay, so assess the risks and learn how and what you can put in place in order to manage them. And to do that, it's a really good idea to have a written plan in place, and it's to manage risk. And it doesn't have to be for a specific risk. The plan can be for, general crisis setting or risk management. But this is the structure that your team will work to. And it could set out the following, and you just think about who needs to be in the team. So who has the skills and experience to deal with risks within the organisation? And it's not always at a senior level. It's, throughout the organisation, different people will have different skills. Setting up a place to manage the crisis. So you need a confidential and secure place to work from. And this could be done virtually if you feel comfortable doing that. You might need to gather information. Remember, you need to find out the context, and sometimes decisions need to be made and you only have limited information. So there'll need to be a process in order to be able to gather information fairly quickly. The plan for having your initial response and who's going to make the decisions. So have a process to log decisions and understand how that filters throughout the organisation. Does everybody know what they are meant to be doing and how they will respond? Do they feel empowered to be able to do it? Communications, work out who needs to know what, including, so not just internally, but also externally. So your partners, donors, your family. Operations, and you just need to make sure that the ongoing situation can be managed. Can you keep going with your operations, core operations in particular? Sometimes there might be little to do, but you just need to make sure that those can continue to function if there is a crisis. And then lastly, closing off a crisis. Once it's come to a resolution, hopefully it was good, it might have been bad. It might not be the end of the work, so there might need to be things to do to learn from that crisis. How could you adapt for next time? What else might you need to do? And what were the lessons and what were the things that went right? So just make sure that even though the crisis is no longer there, following on through from that. And this whole process, and by planning it out, it will show you where the gaps are potentially, and where you may not have thought needs extra support. So I've been talking a lot, I know, so I'm going to get your brains thinking again. And I have a couple of scenarios here for you. So take your time in thinking about this. This is a good way, and when there is the possibility of a risk or crisis, to have these types of scenarios thought about before they happen, to discuss them with your team and within your organisation, and even practice how you might deal with them, can be a useful way to understand how you respond. And I totally understand that this takes time and energy, but for those risks that are high impact, high likelihood, this might be worthwhile you doing, so that you are much more efficient and the risk doesn't become a massive crisis. So the question I'm going to ask you is, what practical action could you take to prevent this situation? And the situation is, there's a crisis. I don't know what, but there is one. And it's been going on for 4 weeks. And the team dealing with it are exhausted. So 2 of the crisis team are off sick due to stress. So I can imagine if there's been something like a natural disaster, wildfires, COVID, you have to really respond. So if you can write in the chat, or if you're feeling brave, I'll take a couple of hands up if you want to talk. What would you do and what actions could you take to prevent, not the crisis as such, but the situation that's resulted from that? So the team are exhausted and 2 of the crisis team are off sick due to stress. Please write in the chat. You're welcome. And I'll keep an eye on the screen in case anybody wants to shout out. Take a moment to think. Oh, great, Claire. I have a core number of people in the team that are active and work on a rotational basis. Thank you. Can anybody add to that? Babs, set up a backup crisis team. Yep, that's a great suggestion. Oh, look, they all come at once, don't they? Enforce a limit to hours worked. Increase the size of the team if needed. Definitely. Delegate responsibilities. Yes, that doesn't happen very often, but yes. Nancy, give them time off. Oh, after assessing the situation and finding an alternative. Great. K, reduce other non-essential activities to help with the above. Definitely. And these responses that are coming through are fairly, seemingly quite straightforward. Sometimes, yes, you might be down to a small team. There's not many of you. So having a backup team is not always possible. But then it's thinking about who else you can call on to be able to take up and have that rotational staff or that second. And Martha, your comment about delegate responsibilities. Yes. But then everybody within that crisis team has to know how to handle those responsibilities and feel empowered to be able to deal with them. So that's a great suggestion. We've got Miriam, regular check-ins to prevent the staff reaching a level of stress where they need time off. Definitely. And then Julie, oh yeah, step back, have a break and review the strategy for dealing with a crisis. And I think that's key too. So, you know, in a crisis, things can become overwhelming, they can become very heavy, and it can become almost panic stations. So taking that step back, having a breath and reviewing the situation. Great. So yes, if G had been here, he would have been impressed with the answers because he asked me this question and I wasn't quite as good as with all these answers. So thank you for those. So yeah, there we go. Give people time off, rotate, and if possible, have 2 crisis teams. Okay, so you thought you could just have one? No, I've got another one for you, okay? How do you prepare or practice this situation? Fire safety and evacuation from your building, especially if it's high rise. So again, just one more time thinking about this, preparing or practicing for this situation. Claire, run regular practice sessions where the stairwell isn't accessible for escape. Okay, I have a feeling you might have done that before. So yes, great. Yeah, Martha, I know that you've done this. Regular practice, weekly test of the alarm. At FFI, we hear that alarm go off a lot. Claire, so people can learn the alternatives. Yes, exactly. There might be different ways to have to leave the building. It's a fairly straightforward one, but not always with the simplest of answers.
I appreciate Claire's suggestion. We'd have drills in our New York office with evacuations and then also with the communication systems, but we've never had a drill that includes a blocked stairwell or anything like that. So I think that's quite helpful.
Definitely. Yeah, same with us, Kate. At FFI, we always all troop outside, but we never experience a real, well, what if this happened, you know? So,
No.
yes.
And people always stay at their desks a little longer sending that email. So yeah, that's really thought-provoking.
Yeah, I think you're right. Thank you for bringing that up. And Claire, I think, yeah, thank you. And Nancy says here, we already have fire extinguishers on designated places. The problem is we don't even know how to use them. But I think prepare with fire mock drives. Yeah, and fire drills. Exactly. David, exactly. Training staff on fire hazards. Yes. But I don't know how to use a fire extinguisher and things like that. So these are great. Some of these suggestions that are coming through. And you're right. And this reason that I put this scenario in was really to say about the practice. Include practice drills, physical drills, where you have these alternatives, a situation, trained people to use the fire extinguishers, making sure that someone checks that the exits are clear. But the thing about this situation is it is quite easy, as Claire and Kate have just pointed out, to become complacent. So, you know it's a risk and you know it's an issue, but unless you really go through the situation, if it did happen, would you be as ready? And could it escalate more than you anticipated? So thank you for exploring with me. So the takeaway here is having a plan is good. Training people in the plan is great. But practicing the plan on the risks that you face is excellent. And we used a simple one here, but this could be for any scenario. So it's better to put energy into prevention of a crisis rather than mitigating the crisis. So I bet most people have a mug in front of them. And you will probably keep it away from the edge of your table every day. You'll just push it, or if you see it get closer, you'll take a little bit of work and push it away, which is much easier to do than it is to have it too close. It falls off, it breaks, and then you have to try and expend a lot of energy putting it back together, and the chances are it'll never be the same again. So yeah, keep your mugs on the table. Just prepare for things. So the last section, we have understood the risks and we've prepared for the risks, but those risks happen anyway. So what do we do? Okay, we need to respond. So the first thing we do is assess. I'll just give a quick definition of crisis. So our risk has got into a crisis. And a crisis is a situation in which something or someone is affected by one or more very serious problems. But the thing you need to know or ask yourself is it actually a crisis? So the more homework you've done on your risks and your mitigations, the quicker you can assess if a situation is actually a crisis. Sometimes you'll get misinformation or assumptions from sources about something happening. But if you know that some projects or things that you're working on have a higher risk level, you can provide closer supervision and just do your research and make sure that you pay attention to what's going on. Sometimes you might have to make decisions with little or no information to hand. So you have to assess, is this something how do we need to deal with this situation? And your response in dealing with the situation can be crucial. But not everything is a crisis, but things that are left unattended can obviously, as I keep saying, escalate. So incidents are day-to-day disruptions. They're normally single events, not turning points for the organization, and are more predictable. A crisis tends to pose a long-term threat to the company's reputation, its effectiveness. It has the ability to have a lasting impact on a company's reputation, or it poses a threat to the stakeholders' trust and confidence in the organization. And it's that turning point. So if it's not handled well and transparently, then it can have massive implications. So it's just thinking, how do we need to deal with this crisis? And there's different ways you can deal with it. There's an immediate or quick fix versus a long-term fix. I'll give some examples here. It all depends on the situation. But let's say there's been a major theft of money in the organization. Well, the quick fix for that, and you can do this every single time there's a theft, you can report the theft and you can potentially try and get the money back through the banks. But actually a long-term fix and makes it less likely to happen is monitoring, putting processes in place to monitor what's happening with the money, and getting proper approval structures in place if there's transactions or withdrawals, so that people can be less likely to steal. There's a road traffic accident and 3 staff are injured, and it was your responsibility. So you can pay for the medical costs and get immediate medical attention for your staff. But actually, a long-term fix here might have been to have standards in place that help people to mitigate road traffic incidents, making sure your vehicles are sound and are not likely to cause problems or break down, and having medical insurance so that your organization doesn't have to put up the costs, an unknown or unexpected cost immediately. So it's just having those in mind. What can we do to manage this in the short, and how can we actually prevent it or manage it in the longer term? You need resources to respond. Any thoughts on resources that, if you could just again write in the chat or shout out? We're a small enough group that if you'd like to just unmute or put your hand up and shout out. But what resources do you need in place? What resources do your organizations have in place to deal with a crisis? Nancy mentioned earlier about responding to COVID and how they were able to do that. So pop it in the chat. What responses do you think? Well, sorry, resources. Yes, recognize the time needed to deal with it. That's a really good answer. Okay, thank you. So understanding how much time you will need to respond to the crisis. Fabiola, yes, plan. We need a plan. Nancy, human resources, yes, financial resources. You totally spoke very eloquently about that in the earlier session today. June, staff with the relevant knowledge. Yeah, exactly. Having the right competencies to be able to deal with the situation. Any others? Well, you'll think of some as we go. So funding being the obvious one, but also having reserves too. So this idea that you have some money ready to respond to a crisis, or in case there is something which you hadn't planned for, or you had, but you weren't able to deal with. So having the funds, but also having the resources, the reserves there to be able to use in times of stress. Having the skills, June, you mentioned that, so having the relevant knowledge, and making sure as well with the funds that you've got the right budget too. So understanding what you would need to be able to not only respond, but also prepare for as well, because it might take training, it might take other things. You might need some physical resources to respond and prepare for. Lanho, collaborate with experts, relevant organizations working on that type of crisis. Brilliant. Have you been reading my notes, Lan? That's a great answer. Thank you. So yes, you're exactly right. Collaborating with others to see what knowledge they have on that crisis. And I will get to that actually in the next slide. Making sure that staff have a clear understanding of their priorities during crisis. So yeah, empowering them to make decisions. And again, making sure that you have access and can afford professional help if you need it. So you can't necessarily do everything in responding to a crisis. You may need others to help you. And then ensuring, again, back to that funding point, ensuring that your business can keep running while a crisis is being resolved as well. So what are the core things that you need to keep going that you can't operate without, and highlighting those. Google help. I love that, Nancy. And actually, I'm laughing, but it's probably a really good suggestion. Going to the internet to find out any information that you can, I think is great. Thank you. Okay. So, Lan Ho, this comes back to your response. What support do you need? And exactly that, external professionals. You may need their expertise for planning for the situation, and also for supporting your staff too. But initially you might need legal support, media support, crisis professionals if you can afford them. And also during a crisis, the well-being of your team is important. So you might need psychological support. And I think, yeah, Julie earlier referred to this, but ensure, or someone did, make sure that when during a crisis, your team are well looked after. And it's important to support them to make sure that we don't get burnout. And make sure that you have a person who can lead and make decisions. And if that person is unable to, who else do the decision responsibilities fall to? And then just, if you have a team that's dealing with a crisis, don't be afraid to change the team if it isn't working. And that's why we practice and prepare. So the last key takeaway before we finish is practice. Practice a lot on the scenarios and thinking what can happen. Improve competence, your own and others, in dealing with the situation and preparing for it. And as you do that, you should become confident that you can deal with the situation. And therefore that leads to hopefully creating that resilience for your organization and being able to deal with things that come your way. Okay, so I've done a lot of talking, and I would love to hear from some of you and or get your questions. So I'm going to stop the share